Welcome to the Sutherland Report. Thank you for giving me your time. As I often say, one of the delights of doing this is that I'm able to catch up with old friends. And I'm about to do that now. I'm just going to bring on my friend George Olson. George and I, with another wonderful group of friends, team, were at Burning Man in the great state of Nevada last summer. George will be there this year with other friends of mine. So I want to catch up with him about that, the fourth turning, and the very sad events that have been happening in Texas in regard to the floods. George, first of all, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining me. It is much appreciated. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
No. Well, it's good to see you. It seems like only last year that we were in Burning Man.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah, and it was only last year.
It's only last year, and I know that we are in the Burning Man cycle. You are in pre-planning and heading towards
That's right.
revisiting. Another dear friends of mine were, of course, Carl Teichrib, and Brian and Audrey will be there. There's you and dear Ginny, and anyone
Mhm.
else going that I
Uh,
may not know.
we have a couple of people that are new to the team.
Right.
Yeah, and so we're looking forward to that. We're hoping in future years we might be able to expand the team to you know
No, that'd be good.
a few more than just the 8 or 9 people that we
Mm.
have.
No, I hear you. George, what is your background? What do you do? Because that will then tie in with why the visit to Burning Man and also the other event. There was another big event a number of months ago in
Yeah.
Texas that you went to with Carl. So if you can outlay that, that'd be great. What do you
Right.
do? Who are you?
Okay. So I am a missionary with Ethnos 360, a long-term missionary. We lived in the Philippines for 12 years, and we worked with a tribal group called the Palawano, as well as let me straighten my glass, as well as after that time, I ended up being the security manager for our field, and I've been doing security management or security analysis for missionaries ever since then. I was also a language coach for learning the Philippine language.
When you say security management, could we just go down into a little bit more depth of that? Because some
Sure.
people might think, oh, that's just making sure the front door is locked at night or the back window is secure. But I'm not being cynical. There are reasons for this. So could you
Sure.
go into that?
Well, yeah. So basically, if you go through Scripture and you look at the way the Apostle Paul conducted his ministry as he was traveling around the world, when he was faced with threats of persecution, he knew about it a lot of times in advance. He knew he was going into dangerous territory. He didn't go with the idea of let's just have I'm just going to trust God no matter what happens. I mean, he was trusting God no matter what happens, but he was letting the Holy Spirit give him wisdom as he was going through. And even there's an incident where his sister's son, so his nephew, alerted him to a plot by some of the Jewish people that were wanting to have him arrested. And uh, and so he went into that with the knowledge of what he was facing. So he didn't go into any situation blind. He had the Holy Spirit to guide him. So what we aim to do is help missionaries when they go into different areas to understand the risks that they face. What are the tensions? What are the risks? What's the likelihood that something negative? And then if you still believe that that's what God is calling you to do, then go. But our job is to help you to understand those risks. And we have a lot of risks today, and a lot of times the risks are not necessarily because we're Christians. Like some of the places where I went in the Philippines, it was a combination of being Christian, but a lot also being an American. The Muslim insurgents did not like Americans. The most Filipinos love Americans, and Americans, I think, generally love Filipinos, or we should if we don't. But the Muslim territory, they don't, because there's a history. And so when Westerners have been kidnapped by Muslim terrorists, it's a little bit of a stretch to feel like they're being kidnapped because they're Christians. A lot of times they're kidnapped because they're Westerners. So that's just a risk. It's a risk that we have to understand, and then you have to decide if you're willing to take that risk. We do analysis on the geopolitical relationships between different nations, on terrorist threats, on crime threats, the whether or not the likelihood of natural disasters in a lot of places, and if there's uh, mitigating measures in place to help people in those natural disasters, so things like that. And how I got connected with Carl at Burning Man and doing all that was because I was following certain trends, and it led me to actually following the UFO space, which leads me to prophecy watchers. And not that we're not worried about our missionaries getting kidnapped by aliens, of course, you know, but the fact that it's become such a prominent cultural thing in the Western world that it bears watching. It bears watching and understanding what is the culture around the UFO belief system, and how is it affecting the way people think? How is it affecting what they're doing? And so in doing that, I was at a conference. I met Carl, and we ended up going to one of the event in Texas last year, the Eclipse event, and then he invited me to go to Burning Man. And then since then, I've gone to I still go, uh, the whole worldview research area. Basically, there's four areas. It's political, religious, technological, and cultural. In all political, religious, technological, and cultural, we're seeing a major worldview shift. Those are the four areas where it manifests. And so because the worldview manifests, is manifesting away from this uh, modernism and postmodernism system that's kind of been sidelined to this more enchanted kind of neo-pagan type belief system, what we're calling the age of re-enchantment. Um, Burning Man is one of the areas where it's like the face of that worldview, because that's where the cultural transformation really takes has the biggest visibility. In the other areas, in the political and the geopolitical area, still, like I've gone to two NATO events this year to understand what's going on with NATO, and we have to undertrack. There's basically three dominant worldviews in the entire world today, and well, I guess I would say four. There's four if you include the Islamic worldview. Uh, but the Islamic worldview, except for the Iranians, is okay with it just being the Islamic worldview for now. The three dominant ones that are really driving geopolitics are the Western worldview, which is the age of re-enchantment, dominates all the Western countries. And it's the one that we tend to focus on mostly in the church, in Christianity. The second is the Russian worldview, and I've been tracking the Russian worldview since I was in the security management and was starting to hear things. And I was hearing about Russian disinformation before anyone was talking about Russian disinformation, and before it became a thing that is now sometimes countered from the Christian community to some degree, where it is an actual real national strategy that they've kept in place. But the Russian worldview is the belief that Russia needs to be a great power and they need to dominate. And it's held by the Russian oligarchs, and it's held and Vladimir Putin is their main kind of source, their leader in that. And then the Chinese worldview. And the Chinese worldview, both the Chinese worldview and the Western worldview are both seeking global domination. The Western worldview is seeking it less so out of an aggressive mentality, but more so out of a belief that that's what's necessary to save humanity. Whereas China is seeking it out of a belief in the kind of the long-term destiny of the Chinese people combined with the destiny of Marxism, the belief that the proletariat will rise up and rule the world. So they're more destiny oriented. The Western world is more a salvation oriented thing. And Russia is kind of in the middle, but they're aligned with China because they feel like NATO and the Western worldview is the biggest threat. And they seek to dominate their region and to expand, but they don't have necessarily a full idea on how far to expand, as long as it preserves what the oligarchs' vision is of Russian integrity. Uh,
Right.
so
So is this what we're calling the multipolar world?
yes, it is. And one of the problems, which I'm going to be writing about pretty soon, is in this multipolar world, there's three forces. And three forces naturally lends to instability. It doesn't, any multipolar force, two forces can balance each other out. During the
Yep.
Cold War, one of the reasons we didn't have a major war is the two forces balanced each other out. Three forces has a tendency to move toward instability. That's the three body problem. It's one of the things, that novel, The Three Body Problem, which they did a series on Netflix, talks about how the gravitational forces of three bodies is next to impossible to model in any kind of predictive behavior. Well, that the mathematics of that work themselves out in other areas, in sociological, geopolitical forces, and imperatives, and the way things end up happening, and especially when you involve human behavior, which is by nature inherently unpredictable.
Right.
So
Right.
that's one of the challenges that we're facing in the world today, is that we have three dominant worldviews that are driving geopolitical forces, and those three forces are, because there's three, it makes it inherently unstable. And at some point, like China and Russia are not natural allies. The reason why China and Russia are on the same side right now is because Russia feels a greater threat from NATO. But at some point in the future, when Russia recognizes that China is not actually in it to help them, I don't think Russia will pivot to being aligned with the West. There's too much that they would have to give up by doing that. But there's already been some cracks in their alignment with China. At that point, that'll be one of the major points where potential instability can really happen. And so, yeah,
George, one of the I mean, we had a number of interesting conversations
sure.
in the Nevada desert, and people may be wondering, well, why were you at Burning Man, guys? Well, we were at Burning Man doing research. We were also there having incredible opportunities to have amazing conversations with people,
Mm,
but it is getting to grips with the culture because
yeah,
with say Burning Man been going on, I think 24 years, etc. The fact that we were there, you and I were in the same seminar with Carl, and then where it's announced the fact that people are pushing for the legalization of hallucinogenic drugs, the fact that
yes,
they have a a war chest to of maybe $80 million, I think, to actually push that through the American legal system, and everyone's going, "What?" Yes. Also, Carl has recently been to Colorado near Denver to the biggest New Age festival where 10,000 New Agers turn up. And basically, again, to push and discuss the whole legalization of hallucinogenic drugs. I was at the Parliament of World Religions in 2023, where I'm listening to Richard Raw and some other people
mm,
that I'll just try and be polite, who are then saying they're from the Baptist Union, da da da, and then having, out of body experiences and thinking that taking hallucinogenic drugs draws them closer to Jesus. I am not making any of this up. Now,
mhm.
George, why, in your opinion, asking the $1 million question that gets us sort of excommunicated from the church body, why, in your humble opinion, why doesn't the church look at these issues? Why doesn't it I am asking a loaded question because I have my own opinions. But why is it not looking at these issues? Why isn't it paying attention to conferences like Pananicon or Pagan Icon that meets? You've just been to two NATO meetings, I think one in Ohio. I'm not sure where the other one, or you could tell me. Why is the church not paying attention to these things?
Well, I guess I would separate the like say the psychedelics
Yeah.
from something like Paganicon.
Mm.
I'd say the reasons are a little bit different. Um, the uh, the reason why they maybe in the psychedelic realm is the church has been conditioned for the last 200 years to have a secular mindset, to have it to be that as the world in at the Paris Festival of Lights in 1791, they declared humanity free from the shackles of the church. And what they meant by that was they wanted to establish a system where truth could be verified, and all truth was based on scientific observations. And that has for 200 years that was pushed into the Western mindset. And we're affected by culture, just like if you go to any other country where Christianity is dominated by some other worldview, that their Christianity is affected by their culture. In the Western world, we're affected by this secularized culture that tends to think that you know that truth is only what we can scientifically observe. And even though we recognize that's not necessarily true, or we recognize that that isn't the only truth, that that's a flawed epistemology, that that's a flawed way of looking at things, because we recognize that God's revelation is the source of truth. Now, the scientific observations is a source of truth, but it's not the only truth. It's part that we would put that in the category of what we call general revelation. Well, when the church becoming so secularized, there's just a tendency to think, okay, well, we have to believe what's based on science. And so that's why you find a lot of the compromise in belief in evolution in the church, because it's said that that's belief based on science, even though there's a lot of flaws in the scientific analysis of it.
Mm.
But it's it's purported as being based on science, and not everybody can be a scientist. A lot of people have other kinds of jobs, so they're like, okay, well, we'll just leave that philosophical debate to the people that study it, who happen to be the scientists. And scientists. So in the medical world, the whole psychedelics thing is being pushed in the public sphere as being a medical issue, as being a medical solution to a medical problem, and therefore is part of science. And so
Got
I
you.
think that's why the church is tending to be so willing, or maybe I don't know how willing, but that's why the church is not necessarily rising up and saying this is a real problem, because and it's a blend, like, I mean, in the actual use of psychedelic drugs, there are some psychedelics that have a legitimate medical solution. What those are, I'm not a doctor. I haven't studied that. I can't speak authoritatively on that, except to the fact that that it should be studied in depth. And the side of the psychedelics that our responsibility needs to be in the church is to understand the spiritual side. And as Carl will tell you in going to that, while they talked about uh, the medical effects, and they talked about how it treats PTSD and other things like that, they also had all kinds of workshops on the spiritual side, and people talking about how they were connecting with
Mm.
luminous beings in higher
Mm.
dimensions while they were high on ayahuasca or
Yep.
some other psychedelic drug. So, and we saw that, at Burning Man and
Mm.
at the Eclipse event, Alex and Allison Gray, who run the Church of Cosmic Mirrors up in New York, they talked about that. She says she has this whole set of letters that, these characters, she says that she was taught those characters by
Mm.
luminous beings that she
Mm.
met in higher dimensions, which is interesting. If you ever watched the movie The Matrix, when it shows the green lines coming
Yep.
down the screen,
Yep. Yep.
those characters look just like the characters that she puts on her art. It's um So the
Well, you mean the stretch Norton ones binary? Yeah.
uh, yeah, I don't know what you call them.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
um, but so that's the psychedelic side. The the other side, like the pagan side and the worldview side, is it's as the Western world has stepped out of Christianity as the main fundamental base, as the main epistemological base. And what I mean by epistemological is the foundation of knowledge, the basis on which people understand and believe what they believe. With Christianity and general revelation and special revelation being removed from the general basis of belief and being replaced with this secular idea
Going. Yeah.
that is only the only thing we can know is true is based on scientific observations. Well, humanity can't live in that for an extended period, and so eventually humanity figures out that's not enough. We need to find some other epistemological base. We need to find some other reason to believe what we believe, because we recognize that not everything is a scientific truth. There are things that we can't explain. Okay? And so, but Christianity is out. And so they go to all these other things. Well, what is Christianity focused on? Christianity tends to lag, okay? Tends to lag behind the changes. And Christianity is still focusing on, in apologetic circles, the problem with Mormonism, the problem with Jehovah's Witnesses, and the problems with other cults, the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, and how do we wrestle with those things. And it's just not made it to the point where it's high enough on everybody's radar to be thinking about it. But it's getting there. I believe it is going to get there. It's going to be getting there pretty soon, because we're seeing these changes come in an exponential pace.
So church then trying to, beginning to catch up. What are you, or trying to pay attention to these things? And
Mhm.
I'm really pleased to hear that. In your opinion, what within church culture, what changes have you seen amongst young people? What are the um we'll come on to another subject in a while, where there's been this tradition where you would have church camps. Young people would come. You were doing wonderful outside activities, teaching scripture, etc., etc.,
Mhm.
and then suddenly they go to university, right?
Yeah.
And I'm saying the obvious. How are you viewing your education frameworks above at that kind of level in regard to the cultural influence on young people within America compared to, say, 25 years ago?
Well, okay. So 25 or almost 30 years ago is when I was in university, and there was already quite a bit of a kind of a left-wing influence among professors in but it wasn't everybody, and I was in engineering, so that's a lot more cut and dry.
Yeah, yeah.
It's although they've managed to make even engineering uh, kind of try and pull it into this realm as well. But the I
How
think
that?
the
Can you give me an example? Sorry, to butt in, George. Could you give me an example of that? That's quite fascinating. Are you talking about in regard to climate change narrative or something like that?
something that could be one. I think it's more in the area of like technology. I have a quote from one of the people at Stanford University who is in one of the scientific or engineering professors, and he talks about how in the engineering and what they're teaching their students now, they feel like they're engineering the future. And really, if you look at it sociologically, once you establish a particular type of idea as a fundamental basis of truth that extends past its natural boundaries, that being scientific observations, we have the idea that's we have this idea that the problems that we face as human beings, the problems in humanity, can be solved by our understanding of technical problems, engineering problems. We can apply math. We can apply things like that, and we can come up with solutions. And it's very subtle because there's some truth to that, but it's not the whole truth, and it leaves out the spiritual side. It leaves out the revelation of truth. And so what I've seen is that if you track the way technocracy developed over the last 150 years, we got to a point where the technocracy is exalted as kind of the be all and end all. And they're thought of as engineers because they know math, because they know how to do math and they went to, but they have taken this area of math and applied it to the social science. And the point, one of the points, I don't know about all of them, but one of the points in particular where they cross over from the realm of actual observations that are objective to something that's non-objective is in the area of statistics. Okay? Mark Twain is kind of famously known as saying, "There's lies, there's damn
Yeah, damn
lies,
lies.
and
And
then
then
there's
there's
statistics."
mm, mm,
Yeah, and he was saying that in an age where statistical analysis was kind of coming of age.
mm.
The the whole idea of statistics, and they give an example. The Probe Center in Austin, Texas, gave a presentation to us at our men's retreat last year on the surveys that they had done on the number of people that had been that were claiming that they it was something to indicate the idea that people are naturally born homosexual.
Right.
And the surveys they did, the surveys that the medical community did, showed this kind of overwhelming proportion of people, or that were had, or this proportion of evidence that they'd done by surveys of doctors and surveys of households to indicate why this is actually completely natural and it's something that people can't control at all. And the Probe Center went and analyzed their survey data, and they showed how they pre-selectively chose groups that already had a tendency to believe that in the first place. But then it's put in a research paper that's peer reviewed, and it makes it look like these are numbers. How can you argue with numbers?
Yeah.
So that's one of the areas where they cross over, that kind of thing. Um, and that would be just one example. And I think but it's something that happens in more than just one location.
I'm finding this fascinating because because as you say is how you're then of course using statistics to then push the outcome that you actually want.
Yes.
And I
Mhm.
suppose from a political point of view, and you see societal changes in America, where
Mhm.
suddenly you have, say, in New York, that I know we're suddenly jumping from maths to political, but there is a
Sure.
point that you then see that the Democratic candidate in New York is is this gentleman called Mamdani, a been to many private schools, mother, an award-winning filmmaker, and he says he's a complete socialist. Um, doesn't really like Jews, Israel, etc. It's all out there. It's all recorded, but the fact that suddenly a group of young people are now going, we want to look at socialism. We would like
Yeah.
someone to control grocery shops and all this kind of thing. To you and I, that would start to spark off a lot of concerns because this has been done in history under Stalin and it doesn't really go very well. And you end
No.
up starving a lot of people in Ukraine
Mhm.
under Holodomor, I think is the word. I might have completely annihilated that for people to look up,
Mhm.
but the actually starving people in Ukraine. What about those kind of cultural roots? Because when you say when you were university, which is well before, well after Vietnam, we're saying all those 60s influence going into the 70s. We're looking at Woodstock and all the rest,
Mhm.
which is the kind of thing in the past that the church is going, oh, we're aware of this. But how come do you think within American society you've arrived at this point where suddenly you've got someone like Mamdani as as a candidate in New York. I know it's a bit of a
Sure,
huge question, George. I do apologise, but it's looking at these cultural, social changes.
sure. Yeah, well, and again, I do think that, someone like Mamdani in New York is a result of of the changing worldview that's been happening over a long period of time. And is there ways that we could have stopped it? Perhaps, but rather than looking at that, just looking at the worldview shifted significantly away from Christianity, away from the Christian belief system, and in different parts of the U.S., like you would never find someone like that elected in Texas. Now you might
No.
get some people that are more on the left wing side of things, but it now we have had some very left people at different times in our politics. The mayor of Houston for several years was an open lesbian and uh, and openly left wing, because there are a number of people that are in the LGBT, or at least in the LGBT camp, that are actually on the conservative side politically. But so uh, it's a combination of things, but it also is the result of people. Let's go back to the 1990s, okay? Or 1989. Francis Fukuyama famously wrote his essay, The End of History. And then he wrote a book a couple of years later. And the idea was that the Cold War was over. And in the Cold War, people had felt such palpable fear of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War that when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, which it hadn't collapsed yet in 1989, but everyone could see it coming, um, the that when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the Western world basically felt like we won, and this was such a huge war, or even though it was a Cold War, it was such a huge effort. We're not ever going to have to fight another war again. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same mentality that the people that fought World War One fought. That's why they called it the war to end all wars. Well, that passed out of fashion pretty quickly, and so they that idea that it was so much. And so what Europe did, Europe had the peace dividend. The the tendency now in a secular mindset, because you've rejected the Christian belief system, part of the idea that they believe, which they even said at the Texas eclipse event, is that humanity is in real danger. Our humanity, the we are in danger of being annihilated. At the Texas Eclipse Festival, there was someone that stood up on the space stage, affiliated with a NASA support group or with NASA, or I don't know, remember who exactly it was. They said, they said, or he said, I think it was a he, said, intelligent civilizations in the universe last around 20,000 years. And if they don't become a spacefaring species, they die off. Now, where did he get that information? I mean, has he talked to all the other intelligent civilizations in the universe, of which we've had contact with this many?
Mm-hmm.
Zero. Well, no, he gets that because he believes that. He believes, and why does he believe that? He believes that because he believes that evolution is an absolute, and that if life evolved here because life just happened to evolve randomly by chance, it had to have evolved somewhere else as well. And if that's the case, then you mathematically look at, what's the projection of life? You reach a certain point, then humanity is in danger of extinction or whatever other intelligent beings there are. And because one, they run out of resources, or two, they'll get swallowed up when the sun finally goes through a supernova, or three, an alien civilization will come and conquer their planet and take all their resources. Kind of like the movie Independence Day. So this mindset is in the mind of many people, and this is where the spectrum of this worldview happens. Is the people on one end of the extreme are at Burning Man, they're going around half naked, going and looking for psychedelic drugs. People on the other end of the spectrum are wealthy people that go to the World Economic Forum, that deliberate on the economic issues, some of which are things that need to be talked about, others of which way far extend their appropriate boundaries and go in the area of philosophy and spirituality. And those, but all those people, they all hold to that same mindset that evolution is the absolute truth. And evolution is the way we got here. And because that's the absolute truth and everything just happens randomly by chance, humanity is in danger and we have to do something to save ourselves. That, by extension, you put that in a population, have them believe it for multiple generations, they're going to come up with certain conclusions. Okay. And the kind of conclusion, one of the kinds of conclusions that they come up with is what is represented by Mamdani in New York, because it's socialism. Socialism is based on the belief that by a collective effort, we can save humanity. It is an alternate salvation message. Now, I was watching the Munich Security Conference online. I also saw it at the on some of the seminars of the G7 meeting and at the NATO conferences. And when you hear people talking about we are the only people on this planet, and we're one people, and we're on this planet, and we have to do what we can to preserve this planet and to save this planet, and the planet this and the planet that. That is all re-enchantment language. That comes from this idea. You go back to Fukuyama, where he talks about the end of history and the peace dividend in the 1990s, when people thought we're never going to have to fight another war. We're never going to have to fight another war. Where do we need to focus our efforts? Well, now what we have to do is we have to save humanity. Because if we don't, the belief is the greedy capitalists are going to use up all our resources. Okay. And so we have to counter that because they're the ones that threaten us. And the Christians are the ones that are getting in the way of this because the Christians don't believe that humanity is under threat from this sort of thing. Now we see that humanity is under threat from something else. We recognize truth. Uh, but you take that and you give an entire generation or a generation and a half from the 1990s. Now you have people born in the 1990s that are 30 years old, like Mandani, and this is all they've known. They've never known war. You're still there? You froze up. Okay, yeah. So they've never known what the threat of war is really like. They're starting to feel it now in Europe, and that's
Yeah.
why Europe is starting to change. But Mamdani in New York, everything still feels like we could do this by a collective effort. And this collective effort, uh, socialism is the natural outgrowth of that belief system. So that's where it
And
comes from.
George, what a brilliant explanation. No, thank you. But the other thing is that people like Mandani, AOC, what's it, Omar and the rest, the
Mhm.
quad-ish plus it now seems to be maybe plus one, even though he wouldn't be in Congress, he'd
Sure.
be trying to be a mayor. And there's others. Then you've got Karen Bass in California and all her links
Mhm.
with Castro in the past, bloody blah.
Right.
Um, so this is their worldview. Why aren't these people looking at previous history? Well, I've referred to the awful events in the Ukraine. Why are they not looking to the fact that centralization of everything does not work? You mentioned earlier technocracy, which is another fascinating subject in itself, especially what was going on in the 30s. And I feel that the UK is run by, a technocrat, a complete buffoon, but that's another thing. But a technocratic mindset. I will stay
Mhm.
within the law. We'll be able to work all this out. Why aren't these people going back to history and learning from history, George?
Well, our friend Carl could give, I think, a better explanation of this, but from my understanding is when the peace dividend happened in the 1990s and there was this shift uh, to teaching people how to be global citizens over citizens of their own state or their own country, their own
Mm,
county, that was worked into the educational system. And the educational system really, in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, de-emphasized teaching history,
Hmm.
and it taught, and it was displaced. There's only so much time in the day that a school can teach things, so it was displaced little by little, probably over time, to the point where the more dominant, more important thing to be taught was the, at least in their minds, was the threat that humanity faces from being from this potential disaster that we're going to bring upon ourselves because of by using up all our resources or causing global warming, a lot of these other things. So I think it comes from a lack of teaching, that has often, well, always been part of the Marxist playbook,
Hmm.
is to not teach history, because history, there's
Yeah,
truths in history that are going to counter the Marxist narrative, no matter what age you're in. So that's always been part of it. Now, I won't say they completely don't study history. They're kind of selective about what history they study, and they de-emphasize some of this thing. Like I know some young people that have talked about how the only reason why Cuba is in the sorry state economically that it is because of American economic pressure, American sanctions, and all those things. Well, and that's just not true. I mean, if the communist system worked, all the communist countries could have formed their own communist economic system, and it would have flourished, you know. And then they could have, the sanctions didn't prevent Russia or Venezuela from supporting their communist uh, ally, or China for that matter. But their system didn't work. Okay, and so, um, but they don't see that. You can't. And when someone is committed to it, because they're committed to it because of an ideological belief, not because they're actually willing to look at the facts. It is ironic that in this idea that they think that, looking at the facts is the way that we actually understand truth, there's certain facts that they're not willing to look at.
absolutely.
And um, we feel like you should look at all the facts. Like when we had someone come and speak to our Sunday school class one time and was showing us the data on what I was talking about earlier, the LGBT uh, data, and how the survey of doctors showed that they believe that 10% of the population is actually born with gender dysphoria. And I called him out on it, and I said, look, those statistics that you're quoting are already skewed. You can't use that as a valid basis for promoting this as if it's an absolute truth,
Hmm.
because the basis on which it comes from is already flawed.
Hmm.
Okay, and he recognized that, and he's a Christian, so he didn't try and counter that. But the um, in the secular world, they don't have a basis, and there's this great fear. They have this incredible fear that humanity is doomed, and it's, you know media and entertainment have kind of stoked that fear to the point where it's kind of in people's minds. Now, I think the one thing the church needs to do is, where we've been in error, is we tend to have a similar fear. Our fear is the fear of them, the fear of the people on the left coming and destroying our culture, and that we tend to be too afraid of that, when we need to be reaching out. We need to be, um, and we need to recognize that God is still in control. He is still on the throne.
Absolutely.
That it's,
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not wrong to call out these things as they're happening. We need
Hmm.
to. We need to recognize them, but we don't need to approach it from a point of view of fear that causes us to hunker down in our basements and wait for Jesus to come back. And that's getting a little on the soapbox, but the parable of the talents. The servant that was considered a wicked and lazy servant was the one that hid the talent and just waited because he was afraid. We need to be actively, because we know that we have an absolute certain reality of this incredible existence that we're having, is just over the horizon of this life, that we're going to be with God forever. We're going to be with Jesus,
Hmm.
and he will be given a resurrection body. We can go through our days without fear, and we should orient our lives in that way. So,
George, a great answer, and
Mm.
I'm sorry, I'm not marking your homework this end. I'm
Right. Yeah.
just thoroughly enjoying the conversation. And I'm reminded of during the 80s when there were those very well-known interviews by G. Edward Griffin with Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB defector, and he was talking about the attack on the West. And actually, when we refer to the wall coming down in 1989, I've then said, well, then communism has come into the West, and then I
Mm.
can answer that, but then we
All right.
tie that up with the Frankfurt School in the 30s. You know, leaving Germany, coming over to America, and giving another tie up in and this to say that this is affecting all countries. Us over here within Europe, the European Union is another whole discussion for another show. But we look at the recent Canadian election, and someone came out with this. Not being clever, but we look at within American culture, Cloward and Piven, the two social scientists that were, I think, third generation in regard to the Frankfurt School, and that Frances Fox Piven is an aunt, or was an aunt, or is an aunt of Mark Carney's wife,
Mm.
Diane Fox Carney. And people go, well, what do you mean? Well, we look at who is influencing culture, and then Mark Carney, of course, Bank of Canada, Bank of International Settlements, and all the other nonsense, WEF, Bank of England, and we're suffering because of that, because of the whole
Mm.
thing of the net zero ideology, and then what's come into to investments. But Mark, George, sorry, in your opinion, why is it so important that you and I sit down and have these discussions? Not that we're wanting to be highbrow,
Right.
but we
Right.
actually, I think fundamentally, I know the answer. We want to educate people, but
Mm.
that's why we have these discussions. That's why you go to these events. That's why Ginny goes with you. That is why Carl has been doing his research for many years. And people, if you haven't bought Carl Teichrib's book, Game of Gods, then that was printed, that came out in 2016, then go and buy it, because it's a 630 odd page manual. It explains so much, and where we are. So, George, why do you think it's so important for us to look at these things? I've gone full circle, coming back to this.
Well, I think it's really important, primarily because I believe that God wants his people to be salt and light. You know, as
Mm,
Jesus said, you are the light of the world, you know, you're the salt of the earth. And we cannot be salt and light if we are not able to communicate from an intelligent with an intelligent understanding of things. And I think about, like, okay, I'll just give an example. With the recent flooding that happened in Kerrville, right
mm,
next to my hometown,
mm,
and so many people I know that have been affected by it. And there's one particular person, I'm not up, I'm about 2 hours north of that now. There's a lady that's in our church, or that used to be in our church here, that has gone completely over to the conspiracy side. And she's
right.
posting constantly about things like how this was actually planned by people seeding clouds right before the
Mm,
event with the intent. Now, besides the fact that, you know, there's always a human tendency to want to assign blame. We saw that in the tribe where we lived in the Philippines. And they just didn't have a scientific way to assign blame. They had an animistic way of assigning blame. But the but just and you look at that, it's like, okay, cloud seeding, and many of the experts have come out, okay, and again, now I don't want to be quoting the experts because a lot of times the experts can be wrong,
mm,
okay, but I just don't see how. I mean, her evidence was she posted a picture of an airplane, or a image from, one of those airline trackers that showed an airplane that was kind of right over that area,
Yep.
at that time. Well, there's thousands of airplanes in the sky at any given moment. Okay? And you can go and get that information and make anything believe what uh, what you want it to believe, and then you can push it and get a number of people to believe that narrative. Okay? And so I just look at that as an example of how this is a terrible tragedy. It's part of the result, I believe, of the natural climatic cycles
Mm.
that happen. One is called the Gleisberg cycle, which happens every 90 years. That's what happened. That's what caused the American Dust Bowl 90 years ago, was not due to fossil fuel burning. The other is the solar sunspot cycle, which is around an 11-year cycle. The solar sunspots are quieting. These are converging all at the same time, causing extreme weather volatility. Okay, so these are two natural cycles that are observed that are part of the natural weather patterns that cause extreme weather volatility. You combine that with the fact that you have people that camp out in a place where that's flash flood alley, and you have the conditions that just happen to work out because there are natural forces, natural processes that cause that event to happen. And it doesn't mean it's meaningless. And do we believe God is sovereign and in control? Yes. Okay. But should the response to that be, let's figure out how we can prevent this from happening in the future? Yeah, it is. But it's not helpful for us as Christians to go out and start saying, see, it's just because of cloud seeding. Okay, that makes us sound very ignorant. Now, and when we sound ignorant, that makes us easily dismissed by the people that are in policy making positions. We have to recognize that regardless of what they think about us, we have a voice. We are part of our democratic societies. We may not be the dominant voice anymore, but we still have a voice. And so we need to educate ourselves and come to understand these things so that we can speak at them from an educated perspective so that we can help people to understand, look, we're not saying we don't believe in science. The
Mm.
world, when the world comes out and says Christians are saying they don't believe in science, and then you have Christians posting on social media how some conspiracy caused someone to go and seed clouds in order to cause this flood, it kind of backs up what the world wants to say about us in order to push us out of positions of influence. So what we need to do is we need to rise up, assert our understanding that we have a voice in the pluralistic societies that we live in, understand that that might bring more persecution, but we're not afraid. And we educate ourselves. We make a point of teaching ourselves what is actually happening so that we can show them that that's the way we show love. We can show them that we care about the things that are happening. We're not going to say, oh, it's just God, there's nothing we can do about it. Even though, as far as God's sovereignty in the natural world, that is an understanding of the sovereignty of God, that he controls all forces. But we're not going to say that we can solve everything by putting in all these things in place. We're going to say we're going to do what we can based on what we know, and understand that there's a lot of things that we can't know. Now, I don't think in this particular case that even necessarily the floodwaters rose in that area at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning when people were asleep. Having you would have to have really, really, really loud sirens all over up and down that to get people out, to wake people up and get them out in time. And so, um, and I think that is something that probably we should have, because that is a dangerous flash flood area. But to blame it on, the other side, the other people that I've seen on social media are blaming the entire event on Donald Trump, because Donald Trump cut the National Weather Service, and the National Weather Service, had they been in place, they might have been able to send out more alerts. And that's a false narrative as well. It's just as false as the cloud seeding narrative. Okay, you have people on both sides. We as Christians have the opportunity to rise up and to be a voice of reason and to show that our faith is reasonable, not that we're trying to placate anybody, but to show that we have a solid basis and uh, a solid understanding of these things, and we can make a difference. So that's why I think it's important for us at this time.
I hear you. And George, on that note, I mean, because also that whole discussion of climate catastrophe, which is a very, very important subject, is very interesting when you were talking about the Dust Bowl of then in the 30s, and something that had been explained to me recently, that if you are then selling loads of tractors and tilling the ground left, right, and centre, then you are creating that soil ready to be distributed in a windy situation, which I thought was fascinating to hear about that as well. George, I just want to thank you for the time. We're up to that nearly at the hour, and I'm going to end this, but just say thank you so much for an amazing conversation, which I hope to do again. I'll say goodbye to you on the other side, and I'll just play us out. But thank you, my
Okay,
friend.
thank you.